It was a sunny day like today when he met her for the first time. The sea was calm, and the slow swell that gently rocked his boat up and down, combined with the summer sun, made the young man feel lazy and drowsy. With his eyes squinted to soften the mirror-like glare of the sun on the seawater, and his thoughts far removed from the reality of the fishing line in his hand, his consciousness did not immediately respond to the impulses his senses registered. It was only when she gave the fishing line a playful tug that he became aware of the mermaid with a shock. The fright and surprise on his face made her laugh, a bright, cheerful sound that lent an almost everyday quality to her appearance. Too stunned to do anything else, he could only stare at her. With mischievous eyes, she looked back. He was 18, with the agility of youth in his body, but with the hard life of a fisherman already in his hands. She was indeterminately young, for although her wide little face looked like that of a 10-year-old, he could just make out more mature curves under the water. They looked into each other's eyes for a few moments, she curious and amused, he somewhat frightened and completely bewildered. Then, as suddenly as she had come, she was gone, with only the white foam and bubbles where her tail had churned the water to convince him that it was not just a fantastic daydream. He sat there for a long time, searching over the water, but she did not appear again. Eventually, he rowed back home without catching another single fish. It was not the same young man who came home that evening as the one who had pushed his boat into the sea that morning. He became quiet and dreamy. Every morning just before sunrise, he loaded his fishing gear into his little boat and rowed out to the wide sea, only to return at sunset, but he did not catch more fish than usual. It also no longer gave him as much pleasure to walk through the lantern-lit narrow streets of the fishing village with the other young men of his age in the evenings, or to go for a beer with them in the fisherman's tavern. It was as if he suddenly had no interest in the things they talked about, as if the things that interested them were no longer important enough for him. A little more than a week passed before the mermaid made her appearance again. The young man's attention was on the fish on his hook, which he was busy pulling closer to the boat, when large drops of water suddenly rained down on him and the boat. He looked up in surprise, but there were no clouds in the sky. When he heard the bright laugh behind him, he knew it was her. He quickly turned to where she was hanging in the water at the side of the boat, but before he could say or do anything, the fishing line cut into his palm as the fish tried to take advantage of the moment in a desperate attempt to escape. The young man immediately turned back and focused on bringing in the fish. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed the mermaid swimming around the boat, watching his struggle with the fish with interest. When he finally had the fish safely in the boat and the hook out of its mouth, he realized that his hand hurt. He noticed that his palm was bleeding where the line had bitten him. The mermaid, who was again hanging over the side of the boat, saw it too and reached out her hand to him while saying something in a strange language. The young man did not know the language, but he understood what she meant. After a moment's hesitation, he placed his hand in hers. The mermaid carefully examined the cut in his palm. It was not deep and had actually bled little. Nevertheless, she held his hand in hers and made sympathetic sounds in her strange-sounding language. The young man suddenly stiffened and almost pulled his hand out of hers. The mermaid was naked. He stared, petrified, at the two rounded breasts that peeked cheekily through her long dark hair. It was the first time the young man had seen more than just the neck, or bare arms or calves of a woman, and the moment almost overwhelmed him. However, there was nothing sensual about his perception. It was rather as if an element of sanctity was added, which heightened the almost unreal magic of the moment for him. The mermaid immediately noticed the change in the young man and let go of his hand. When she saw what his attention was focused on, she blushed and immediately disappeared under the water. This time he only had to wait 2 days before the mermaid visited him again. She did not surprise him unexpectedly again, but first appeared from the depths a whole distance from the boat and then swam slowly closer. She also did not hang on the boat but stayed at a safe distance. The young man realized that he would now have to win her trust and was careful to only look at her little face. They did try to start a conversation, but he could not understand her language at all, and she very little of his. After a while, she turned around and swam away again. The next day she visited him again. And the day after that, and the day after that. Her visits became a daily occurrence, and over time she also lost her shyness towards the young man. Sometimes she was playful and surprised the young man by splashing him unexpectedly, or throwing a wet piece of seaweed at him. Sometimes, when the fish did not want to bite, she led him to another part of the sea where he then caught plenty of fish. A few times she brought a beautiful shell or interesting sea creature for the young man to look at. Then he marveled at the childlike nature and joy of life with which she explored and experienced the world around her. With the mermaid's help, the young man became an extremely successful fisherman in a very short time. He always brought fish home and usually had enough left over to sell at the market. When he had saved enough money, he bought her a beautifully decorated pendant on a fine gold chain and took it with him to the sea the next day. She met him at the usual place. This time she brought a silver coin from the depths to show him. The young man looked at it carefully, but could not recognize it and assumed it must be a very old coin from the wreck of a ship that probably sank centuries ago. In turn, the young man took out the pendant from his pocket but kept it in his hands so she could not see what it was. The mermaid was very curious, and they playfully wrestled for possession of the pendant. Amid cheerful laughter and incomprehensible remarks, he allowed her to pretend to pry open his hands, and finally, she could look at the pendant where it lay in the hollow of his hand. She said nothing at first but carefully picked it up by the chain to get a better look at the motif on the pendant. In the gold frame of the pendant, a semicircular piece of ivory was clamped, and in the ivory, the relief of a mermaid was carved. It was done very realistically, and the young man believed that the artist must also have known a real mermaid, like him. He was quite surprised to find this piece of jewelry in his hometown and immediately decided to buy it as a gift for his mermaid. Her reaction was not what he expected. She stared, petrified, at the mermaid motif, as if it filled her with fear or horror. The young man watched the mermaid worriedly. Suddenly, she violently threw the pendant over his head into the sea, slipped over the side of the boat, and with a quick flick of her tail, disappeared under the water. The young man was devastated. What had he done wrong? She was clearly excited about the pendant until she saw the motif, but what was wrong with it? Do the mermaids perhaps believe it is wrong to make an image of themselves? Did the mermaid on the pendant possibly remind her of someone? The young man was confused and eventually rode home without finding an answer to these questions and without the mermaid returning to him. She did not come the next day, or the day after that. After 2 weeks, he realized that he would probably never see her again, but still, he faithfully rode to the place where they usually met every day, anchored there, and waited all day in vain for her to return to him. It was precisely because his eyes were fixed on the water that he did not notice the signs of the approaching storm. The first he became aware of it was when a gust of wind jerked his little boat sharply to the left, and he almost fell into the water. Frightened, he became aware of the soft rumble in the dark, rolling clouds above him. Now he also felt the force of the wind against his sunburned skin and saw the whitecaps on the wave crests. Was it too late? Quickly, he grabbed his fishing gear, seized the oars, and engaged in the age-old struggle of the fisherman against the sea. With great effort, he rowed in the direction of the natural harbor where the village was located, while the wind tried with all its might to drive him towards the dangerous rocks south of the harbor. Drenched with sea spray and sweat, he saw the rocks coming closer. It spurred him to greater effort, and for a few minutes, it seemed as if he would win the battle, but it was as if the wind and the waves had joined forces to crush the young man and his boat against the rocks. He collapsed powerlessly and exhausted over the oars. Then suddenly, she was there. In a fraction of a second, she appeared from the depths between him and the rocks, pressed her hands against the side of his boat, and with powerful strokes of her tail, began to steer the boat away from the rocks. The young man was too surprised to react at first, but when she urgently shouted something to him through the thunder of the breakers, he came to his senses and began rowing like a madman again. Initially, it did not seem as if they would get the boat away from the rocks, but inside the young man, there was a jubilation. "She is here, she is here," was the cry of his heart, and he did not doubt for a moment that he was saved. With new strength in his tired muscles, he rowed as he had never rowed before, and after a few minutes, his boat began to move past the rocks, first slowly and then faster as the shelter of the harbor deprived the wind and waves of their power. Exhausted, he rowed to the nearest beach. He slowly climbed out and tried to drag the boat to safety, but if the mermaid had not pushed from behind again, he would never have managed it. Once the boat was safe, he simply collapsed on the wet sand, too tired to stand. The mermaid was also exhausted and crawled out of the breakers, collapsing next to the young man. The young man slowly turned on his side to look at her. Her eyes found his, and, like the sea, almost engulfed him in their depths. The difference was that here he was not a victim but rather a willing slave. Here he did not find death but peace and safety. It was as if, after a lifelong wandering, he had finally come home. With her hand in his and his heart in hers, the young man fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When he woke up, the storm had subsided, and his mermaid was gone, but he rode home calmly and untroubled in the moonlight. He knew he would see her again. At home, he was greeted with tears of relief, a warm bowl of soup, and many questions. Why had he not returned when the storm arose? How had he survived the storm? He first calmly sipped the soup and then said, "I was saved by a mermaid." His family looked at each other incredulously. Had the young man lost his marbles in the raging sea? Had fear of death robbed him of his senses? Had the devil perhaps stolen his soul? His mother involuntarily made the sign of the cross. He knew they would not believe him, but he still told the story from the beginning. He was right, they did not want to believe him, but they could not think of a valid explanation for his narrow escape and eventually went to bed quietly. The sun was already high when the young man woke up again. In the house, it was quiet, but outside he could hear an unusual noise. The aftermath of his struggle against the sea and his deep sleep still weighed heavily on his eyelids and in his muscles, so he did not want to pay attention to the excitement, but then one voice isolated itself from the noise and quickly moved closer to the house. It was the young man's brother, and he was shouting something about a mermaid. The young man quickly jumped out of bed, pulled on his pants, and ran outside barefoot with a bare chest. When his brother saw him, he shouted, "The mermaid, your mermaid is down at the beach. Come quickly, she is in danger." Together they ran to the beach. There, the mermaid was swimming around in the shallow breakers about 40 paces from the rocky shore, but so were a number of men. With a shock, the young man realized that they were trying to trap the mermaid and catch her in a net. "Leave her, she is mine," he shouted, but the men in the water either did not hear him or decided to ignore him. "Leave her," he shouted again and tried to run into the water to help the mermaid, but in his haste, he stumbled over a rock and drew a furrow in the wet sand with his nose. Frantically, he jumped up again but saw that he would be too late to help the mermaid. Desperately, he grabbed a rock and threw it with all his might at the man closest to the mermaid. It was as if time stood still. The seconds the rock flew through the air ticked by like an eternity. Even the breakers came to a halt, and the seabirds hung motionless in the air to watch the flight of the rock with unfeeling eyes. There was no sound other than the hiss of the rock through the air and the cry in his heart, and there were no people other than the mermaid in the water and the young man on the beach. It was a sunny day like today when he saw her for the first time. Then, the vitality had swirled in her eyes like the breakers, and he had given his heart to her. Now, her face was calm and relaxed as only death can mold the features. The dark hair formed an uneven frame for the broad little face, but did not quite manage to cover the bump where the rock had struck her. The picture was completed by the coffin in which the village constable had placed the mermaid. The young man sat quietly and despondently while the constable completed his report. Outside, the sun shone just as brightly as before, but here in the constable's office, it was cool and quiet. In his hand, the young man held the pendant with the mermaid motif on it. His brother had found it in the young man's boat this morning and immediately brought it to him. However, the pendant no longer looked exactly the same. Someone had very carefully and neatly altered the motif so that no one would know if they had not seen the pendant before. The hair of the mermaid on the motif now fell in stylish scallops not only over her shoulders down her back but also covered the once rounded breasts.